Idealism persists even to this day. We've especially discussed American idealism. There's a tendency to view international politics through a moralistic or idealistic lens. For instance, when people see Putin act a certain way, they might say Putin's just a bad guy, that's why he acts like that. Or when something happens, they ask, who has the rightful claim here in the first place? They tend to approach international politics through moral or legal frameworks. But have we looked at it through the lens of power, through raw power? Like saying Russia's behavior makes sense, it's because power dynamics cornered them. Or Germany acted so foolishly, they basically invited Russia in. But we don't usually look at it like that, do we? Isn't it usually about who's right or wrong, or what's legal or illegal? All of that is idealism, to put it a bit bluntly. But if you try to apply that mindset to the beast-like world of international politics, you end up with what we've seen from American elites. Lots of starts, no real finishes. In the last 20 years of strong American idealism, have they seen anything through to the end? Afghanistan, Iraq, for example. Sure, maybe some progress was made in defeating ISIS, right? Even the Korean War was left unfinished, wasn't it? They always hit the wall of reality. That's when the question arises, where are we and who are we? That's exactly what happened in the Vietnam War. What are we even doing here? And then massive internal conflict erupts. It starts with idealism and ends in retreat because of that same idealism. Vietnam is a textbook case of that. Over the past 70 years of idealism-driven foreign policy, America has failed at almost everything it touched. Only when wise realist leaders stepped in did they repair the damage and pull back. That's the narrative I've tried to outline. Idealist leaders rarely accomplished anything of substance. That's why it's hard to label the US as imperialist. Not because it seeks moral imperialism, but because it has failed so many times. This era of American dominance, as you've probably felt over the last 5 lectures, shows that America is not omnipotent. It's been cornered repeatedly and only narrowly regained leadership. That realization may be settling in for you. Americans especially like to think their country is exceptional because it claims to pursue moral values. But in truth, it's hard to call the US imperialist in the classic sense. Even I believe it doesn't quite fit that category. Not because it upheld noble ideals, but because its idealism paralyzed effective action. Take Okinawa, for example. America took it at great cost during the war. They lost countless Marines capturing it, but later they allowed a referendum and let it revert to Japan. Even though they maintained a military base there, they offered to relocate when local residents complained. There were some incidents, but in any case, the US said, fine, we'll move. The Okinawa local government held multiple elections over that issue, and local leaders opposing the base kept getting elected. Meanwhile, the central government in Tokyo seemed to enjoy the situation. They'd say, well, at least we're maintaining good relations with the US. In the US, pro-alliance voices insisted the troops in South Korea and Japan are crucial. They play a vital role in Northeast Asia, but those alliance advocates found themselves losing ground. When Donald Trump campaigned in 2016, he gained explosive popularity. The media dismissed him as a tempest in a teacup, but I didn't see it that way. His speeches were quite engaging, and if you look back at them, he mentioned Korea once every few times, but he always brought up Germany and Japan. Because to Americans, Germany and Japan are the countries they defeated in war, and yet those countries are now thriving. That makes them ideal examples to talk about with the public. For 10 years, the Okinawa base issue left the US paralyzed, unable to act either way. Japan's stance on the issue really infuriated the US, and Trump called that out directly right after Trump was elected, even before his inauguration. Shinzo Abe, yes, the late Prime Minister Abe, rushed to meet him, setting pride aside. An empire, in the traditional sense, wouldn't behave like that. They'd say, like, this land is mine, I took it with blood, and they'd evict the natives, out, get out. But once American idealism lays out the board, the Europeans come to play. We'll talk about Europe today because we simply can't avoid it. If you study modern history, you'll find that most good and bad things can trace their roots back to Europe. Of course, that's rhetorical. Nothing is ever truly everything. But an overwhelming amount of both good and bad originated in Europe. Even today, Europe, though it doesn't call itself the global community, plays a unique role within what we think of as the global community. Europe serves as the opinion leader. When the US sets the table, it's all about power politics. That's the nature of international relations. And the players who always show up, Europeans, But this time they got burned because of Russia. Putin flexed real muscle, real power. There's an institution called the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It's essentially the predecessor to today's international criminal courts. It was created in response to the massacres in Yugoslavia. They established it in the 1990s as an international tribunal. Its purpose was to handle horrific crimes like genocide that domestic laws couldn't address. It was a call for crimes against humanity. And of course, it was driven by the US. But Americans couldn't exactly sit on the bench themselves. So they sent Canadians, Europeans, and the like to realists in international politics. This whole thing was a farce. But idealists took it all very seriously. Many of you might feel the same way. Shouldn't international politics be governed by law? Like in the case of territorial disputes, shouldn't legal principles settle this? We assume there must be some objective standard we can rely on, and that everything can be judged through a clean syllogism of what's right or wrong. That's a rather naive belief. There was a time when no one could challenge America on the global stage, and that's when American idealism operated without constraint. Given the chance, this is how the US naturally tends to behave. The United Nations itself was a product of this idealistic impulse. But do you know what actually happened? Kosovo was bombed. NATO did it, specifically Europe without the US. The Balkans are Europe's backyard, and yet they couldn't resolve a thing. The region near Greece is extremely ethnically complex. Historically, parts of it were once under Turkish rule. Although it's in the heart of Europe, it was Ottoman territory for 300 to 400 years. In ancient times, Roman nobles sent their children to study across the Adriatic, to study in Greece. Rome held the power, but culturally, Greece was the Europe of that time. Even now, Americans go to study in the UK as Rhodes Scholars. This central part of Europe was long dominated by Islam, even until fairly recently. Amid all that complexity, massacres broke out, prompting military intervention. Europe couldn't handle it, so the US stepped in under the NATO banner. Then they asked the International Criminal Court to take up the matter, and the prosecutor there tried to indict the NATO commander. Diplomats and politicians were dumbfounded. The claim was that human rights had been violated during the bombing. So the very system they created turned against their own exercise of power. They didn't entrust these matters to aliens or gods, but to a human-made court grounded in reason and law. That belief that humans could judge such matters rationally led to this absurdity. A prosecutor attempting to indict the commander of NATO. It's an extreme pursuit of moral purity. Even in bombing campaigns, they expect each bomb to be guided by perfect intelligence so that only the guilty are killed and the innocent spared. But if civilians are killed, that becomes grounds for prosecution. Of course, the successor couldn't pinpoint an individual in NATO to hold accountable, so the indictment was ultimately dropped. But setting up this kind of system leads to some truly bizarre episodes. Absolutely surreal, no other way to put it. Now take Chile's infamous dictator, Pinochet, a morally complex figure who also helped modernize Chile. If he were a truly monstrous dictator, he wouldn't have relinquished power. Though others argue he gave up power only because he had no other choice, and that's one interpretation, sure. But remember, Napoleon and Hitler ruled until their deaths. After stepping down, Pinochet went to the UK for medical treatment, and activists tried to indict him, leading to a case before a British court. What's important is that all of this happened during what I call history's holiday. That holiday began after the fall of the Soviet Union and lasted, depending on how you see it, until September 11th in 2001, or more broadly, until now, as China rises to challenge the US people around the world, including you and me, have come to believe that realpolitik, once practiced by our so-called barbaric ancestors, was something a more enlightened humanity would have grown out of. They engaged in it because they were primitive, but we, being rational beings, should be able to negotiate and discern right from wrong through reason. Borders, what meaning do they even hold anymore? Among all human-made institutions, perhaps the most useless is the nation-state. This kind of thinking dominated global discourse for 2 or 3 decades. Looking back now, it almost feels like a dark comedy. Corporations exist, NGOs exist. But the state, why do we still need that? Who benefits from it? We've arbitrarily drawn lines across the globe, dividing everything up. Humans should be able to cross freely like birds in the sky. This belief that states should vanish is pure idealism. But here's what happens. We assume idealism naturally leads to justice. But its fatal flaw is this. Idealism ends up betraying the very ideals it claims to uphold. It undermines the values it set out to protect. What would have happened if soldiers hadn't bombed the mass murderers in Kosovo? Henry Kissinger puts it this way: unelected elites fill international organizations like the UN or the EU Commission. We could call them global drifters, professional international elites. Europe is especially full of them. When unelected elites wield reason as a tool of power, they erode the sovereignty of the state where reason and politics are meant to converge. In doing so, they undermine their own foundation, leading to anarchy. What this means is that the state itself represents both power and reason. So whether advanced or not, every state operates within this dual framework. A state functions with reason, but because it deals with reality, it must also carry force. Pretending power doesn't exist may sound noble, and if every international problem could be solved by law, we could just say, China's 9-dash line has no legal basis. Please leave. And then China would reply, our apologies, will withdraw. That's the world we dream of. There would be no war in that world. There's an English expression, putting the cart before the horse. That's exactly the kind of logic this idealism reflects. When international order is established through balance of power, only then can we start drawing from the account of law and morality like cash from an ATM. Running the world on law and ethics alone doesn't eliminate war. Even if we all interpret law and morality with perfect clarity, if the power structure behind global order collapses into a vacuum or undergoes abrupt destabilization, humanity knows only one response. We resort to power, we settle it by force, and the most powerful actor in that equation is the state. So consider how deeply polluted idealism distorts your thinking. Are you starting to see how far it is from reality, or do you still have a long way to go? Maybe what I've laid out over the past 5 weeks still doesn't fully resonate with you. It's time we turn our attention to Europe. History leaves us with certain mysteries. Not mysteries exactly, but fundamental questions. And one of those questions is this. Why did World War I happen? We have a fairly clear understanding of World War II, but World War II was essentially a rematch, a sequel to World War I. Put simply, World War I ended without resolution. The unresolved issues of World War I, combined with a few new ones, ultimately triggered what we now call World War II. So we shouldn't see the two as separate. There was just a 20-year armistice in between, and even that so-called peace was far from peaceful. It was during this interwar period that critical decisions were made in global finance. These decisions made during the interwar years, that is the period between the two wars, are believed to have directly contributed to World War II, especially due to certain economic misjudgments, chief among them, those of Keynes. And that's how the Bretton Woods system we live under today was eventually born. This system too will eventually shift, of course, but to understand it fully, we must revisit the financial decisions made during the interwar years. We have to grasp the changes that reshaped international finance, and to understand that, we must understand World War I. Keynes believed it was a war that simply couldn't happen. He was already a celebrated professor at Cambridge in Britain. He claimed that the war won't last more than a year, because by then Europe will have run out of liquid assets to fund it. And when people disagreed, he'd snap, "You fools." But in hindsight, he was the one who was wrong. Before Putin invaded Ukraine, we heard similar arguments. He'll never invade, it's just a bluff. He has neither the money nor the arms. We keep confusing what shouldn't happen with what can't happen. Of course, war shouldn't happen, but does that mean it won't? World War I was such a horrific war, but our historical perspective is a bit different. Because our history followed a different path. For our ancestors on the Korean Peninsula, the 19th century was far from happy. Arguably, it was the most tragic period in Korean history. So it's hard for us to relate to Europe's version of the 19th century. Europe's experience was completely different. The 19th century was Europe's golden age. Historian Timothy Snyder notes, no adult living in Europe in 1914, the year World War I began, ever again experienced that level of civilization. If you were 20 years old, then you never saw that prosperity again in your lifetime, because it took Europe until the 1960s to recover that level of civilization. Europe was devastated by World War I. The first half of the 20th century was more backward than the 19th. That wasn't the case for the US, but it was for Europe. So why did this First World War even break out? It began with a complex political assassination in the Balkans, and specifically in Serbia. The Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, was allied with Germany. Russia, France, and Britain formed the opposing alliance. Italy took one side in World War II, but in World War I, France and Britain persuaded them to switch sides. They convinced the Kingdom of Italy to align with them, so the map of alliances can look a bit odd. In World War I, Italy fought on the Allied side. Anyway, these three powers were aligned. As you can see, Europe was relatively simple back then. The map was much simpler than today. Modern-day Ukraine and Poland didn't exist. This was all part of Russia. You had Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. And yes, Russia, Britain, and France were encircling Germany. World War I emerged from this intense geopolitical configuration. Geopolitics poses questions like these. Hitler was evil, right? But was Hitler truly an exception? Not to belittle the German people, but was his behavior diplomatically strange? Yes, he did horrific things, morally repugnant things, but were his diplomatic moves irrational? Not really. Most mainstream scholars would agree. Aside from his atrocities, he was a military strategist and a shrewd diplomat. So here's the key point. John Mearsheimer, author of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, a leading offensive realist, argues that even without Hitler, Germany would have likely turned aggressive by the 1930s. That's how geopolitically tense Europe was. Diplomatically, the similarities between Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany, the former led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who triggered World War I, these similarities stand out most clearly in foreign policy. Hitler shared the same geopolitical worldview and belief in inevitable conflict, and the same ambition to dominate Europe. World War I simply clarified the validity of geopolitical logic. What did American idealists think of Nazi Germany trying to take over Europe? The US was then steeped in idealism and isolationism, and realist voices were marginal at best. So what made even the isolationists and idealists support entering the war? Was it because the Nazis were massacring Jews? No, it wasn't. States don't engage in noble action for its own sake. They may act nobly, but not for the sake of moral purity. They don't send millions of their young to war for purely ethical reasons. But here's what they can do. To justify their war effort, Hitler had to be portrayed as the devil. Even if it weren't true, you'd still need him to be the devil, but in this case, it actually was true. Remember what I said last time? Let's review. The reason China's rise is threatening to us is simply because it's getting stronger. Even if China were a nation built by angels, it would still stress us geopolitically. But it's not. It's spread COVID. It's pushing for permanent rule. It's aggressive toward its neighbors. And it's trying to massively expand its sphere. Classic expansionism. That's why the situation is heating up. It's the same with the US. What Hitler did to the Jews was truly unforgivable. But even putting that aside from a realist perspective, the US couldn't just sit by while Germany overran all of Europe. Germany's geopolitics remain the same even today. You're seeing the same dynamics play out right now. It's the German problem. Isn't all of this fundamentally geopolitical? Who blew up the gas pipeline? The pipeline's endpoint is Germany. So who did it? Use your imagination. Ukraine itself might have had a strong incentive. Germany has formidable powers on both sides, Russia to the east, France to the west. And neither side is especially friendly when Germany is vulnerable. There's no natural barrier to insulate Germany from either direction. So the German mindset is we must become strong. And whether it's cultural or not, they do become formidable when unified. Medieval European history is a long story of dividing Germany into many principalities in order to preserve the balance of power. Because when Germany unites, trouble tends to follow. From Bismarck onward, German leaders have consistently pursued military and strategic strength. More importantly, to the east of Germany lie Poland and Ukraine, home to some of the world's richest farmland. With control over that region, and Germany can not only feed its population, but also pursue some lofty vision of national greatness. People say Korea's geopolitics are bad, but I'd say it's actually not that bad. At least compared to Central Europe, right? We're surrounded by sea on three sides. Projecting force across the sea is never easy. We rightly revere Admiral Yi Sun-sin, so do I. Even for the fierce samurai of Japan, it was extraordinarily difficult to project power across the sea, even though the Korea Strait isn't that wide. That also means Britain was always somewhat removed from the core of continental politics in Europe. It's only about 30 kilometers wide, just 30 kilometers. Today we even have undersea trains crossing that gap. And yet that narrow stretch has always made Britain the exception in European geopolitics. Britain always had the luxury of staying above the fray. We may not be as fortunate as the British, but geopolitically we're not in bad shape at all. It's not like we're in a terrible position. Compared to places like Germany or Ukraine, we're in much better shape, right? Let's talk about Mongolia's geopolitics. Imagine being born in Mongolia. What's their geopolitical reality like? They're landlocked. Everything must pass through either China or Russia. They don't have the luxury of raising their voice. The only historical workaround, Genghis Khan, shows up. He sweeps through everything. Only when they're strong can they assert themselves. When they're weak, they get trampled again and again. Just think about Mongolia. Germany has a coast, so it's not exactly like Mongolia, but geopolitically it's pretty similar. Russia's expansionism is well known, and Germany's surrounded. You could say Germany's national identity was forged in that crucible. Before World War I, Europe was the domain of emperors and kings. This photo was taken at King Edward VII's funeral at Windsor Castle. The remarkable thing, they're all related. Norway, Bulgaria, Portugal, Germany, Greece, Belgium, all cousins. And yet Wilhelm II of Germany, blamed for World War I, was one of them. He went to Britain to attend his uncle's funeral. Imagine it this way. Imagine if Korea's Joseon dynasty had blood ties to Japan. Say Emperor Gojong's mother was Japanese, but his father was from the Yi royal family. That's the kind of bloodline complexity you saw in Europe. Over the last 200 years, Britain's royal blood is more German than British. Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was the face of the British Empire in the 19th century. She reigned for over 60 years. Her daughter's son, that makes Wilhelm II her grandson. So his maternal grandmother was the Queen of England. There were two President Roosevelts in the US. One led the country during World War II. The other, his uncle, was president at the end of the 19th century. That earlier, Roosevelt tried to prevent World War I as a diplomatic envoy. He met Wilhelm II, who told the former US president, "I was raised in Britain. I feel a part of me is British. I admire England deeply," he said. He was reassuring the American president, "As long as I live, Germany and Britain will never go to war." But anti-German sentiment in Britain ran so high. Even kings, Edward VII and Edward III had German fathers. Their dynasty bore a German name taken from a German region. But because they had to fight Germany for public sentiment, they rebranded the monarchy as Windsor. That's how closely linked Germany and Britain were. This is why you must study geopolitics through a realist lens. It's like saying, as long as countries trade with each other and stay interconnected, and if we just build international institutions, then war will disappear. But when you look back at World War I, you realize these royal families were so interrelated. Same fathers, same grandfathers. People said, how could they go to war? They're practically family. And yet what happened? They fought. Why? Because it wasn't the individuals, it was the state acting. And the state doesn't care about family ties. You didn't know Europe was that entangled, right? You probably didn't know Queen Victoria's mother was German either. That's why I get it now. There are constant conspiracy theories about the British royal family's ties to the Nazis. Before the Nazis became a universally recognized enemy, there's a photo of young Queen Elizabeth Thad giving a Nazi-style salute with her family. They try to erase those, but every time one surfaces, it shakes Britain. It's kind of like our own history with pro-Japanese collaborators. Imagine, for instance, that Emperor Gojong had a queen, though we didn't use that title. Suppose the Joseon dynasty had continued and produced a queen, and her father's name was something like Tanaka, clearly Japanese. But because of national sentiment, Tanaka, maybe they'd change it, use the character Jong and make it Jung instead. But you can't rewrite history forever. Britain's golden age in the 19th century was rooted in a steady ascent that began in the 18th. They laid the institutional and societal foundations for massive development. I'm talking about Britain and the US in parallel now. Both are maritime powers, so they've always prioritized commerce. But it wasn't just about promoting trade, unlike Spain or Portugal. Britain learned finance from the Dutch and developed a strong financial sector. They incubated that through the 18th century, and by the late 1700s, in the contest over Canada, they beat France in what you could call the UEFA final of empire. From that point on, France was forever second to Britain, which became number one. And France lost that war over Canada not because of inferior troops, but because the British issued war bonds. They mobilized their citizens financially, fought with borrowed money, and they won without triggering inflation. France, on the other hand, kept printing money, wrecking itself from within. That's part of what led to the French Revolution. British imperialism, just from this angle, is worth studying in depth. Britain had more colonies than any other empire in that era, but was British imperialism as horrific as idealists often assume? Honestly, not entirely. The image we have is of Europe as a vampire draining Africa and Southeast Asia. And sure, there's truth to that. But that's not the whole story. From Britain's perspective, there wasn't even much need to go to such lengths because running an empire is massively expensive. Take the East India Company. Warren Hastings was its governor. He was called back to Britain and tried for 7 years despite having acted quite responsibly. Even so, the British public made an issue out of it. The governor of the East India Company was appointed by the Crown. They called him the Viceroy, and that marked the beginning of actual colonization of India. Even at its peak, Britain didn't govern all of India. It was simply too vast. Anyway, running an empire costs a fortune. Adam Smith criticized British imperialism harshly in terms of efficiency. Britain also made massive investments around the world. So if you compare Britain to France, Germany, and others, Britain invested far more, right? Britain's overseas investments reflected its trade surplus, unlike the US. They didn't have a trade deficit, they had a trade surplus. That surplus allowed them to invest globally. George Friedman puts it this way: the mistake Spain made was looting too much wealth and taking it home, which led to the collapse of the societies they had conquered. Spain represents the worst model of colonialism. They just sucked everything dry, and in doing so, their colonies collapsed. That's why they never became sustainable colonies. Britain, on the other hand, invested strategically, which raises an interesting question. When the British sailed west, they thought they had reached India, not the British specifically, but in any case, the region came to be called the West Indies. They colonized the West Indies, and they also colonized the East Indies. The East Indies became India, the West Indies became America. Wait, if Britain colonized both, why did one become America and the other India? That's a valid question. People do ask it. Anyway, one became India, the other America. Both were birthed by Britain. Britain invested so its colonies weren't destroyed. America is the best example. The colony grew so strong it eventually expelled the mother country. No Spanish colony ever did that because they were too heavily drained. The peak of the British Empire was World War I. World War I marked Britain's height as an empire. If they hadn't gone straight to war from their peak, they might have held their empire longer and not become America's sidekick. You remember the Suez Crisis? I mentioned it before. They wouldn't have suffered such humiliation. That's where Britain ended up. This was the global map in the 1920s. If you look at that map and notice something odd, you're a genius. I didn't. I realized only after reading it in a book, but I didn't feel anything was off at first. Look at Britain. It has no nearby colonies, especially not a single one in Europe. Britain had distanced itself from continental Europe. One reason Britain was able to maintain its empire for so long is that it didn't seek hegemony in Europe itself. There were already too many great powers in Europe. Isn't that familiar? When America's founding father Washington passed, maybe not a will, but in his farewell address, he warned, never get entangled in wars with European powers. That was his strong advice. Europe was to Britain what Eurasia is to the US today. America just operates on a larger scale than Britain did. Britain left Europe alone except for Gibraltar. It just held the Mediterranean gateway. You have to understand Britain's strategic character. It practiced offshore balancing. From Europe's perspective, Britain is overseas across the sea. Because it's an offshore power, Britain intervenes in Europe, but only to maintain balance, not to occupy. America's doing the same today. From America's perspective, Africa lies on one side, and Korea and Japan are on the other. The US engages to balance, not to occupy, at least usually. But because of idealists, they got things like Iraq. Same with Korea and Vietnam. Once Britain stepped back from Europe, it was dominant globally. In terms of territory and population, France was second, but barely worth calling second. Let's compare Britain and America. They're incredibly similar. Maybe because America was born from Britain. They even look alike in some ways. It's not just the language. They're structurally very similar. By 1880, Britain accounted for a quarter of global manufacturing and trade, not just Britain proper, the entire empire. They invested faithfully in colonies like Australia and Canada. In fact, they invested more than they extracted. Britain policed the world's oceans with ships. That's where their naval vessels were stationed. Back then, they didn't have aircraft carriers, but today the US has carriers everywhere. The patrol strategy is quite similar. 19th century Britain protected global trade routes. Starting next session, we'll go deeper into finance. Britain was the defender of the gold standard, unlike the US. Yes, the country that upheld gold, the gold standard itself. If America had its Vietnam, we've already studied Vietnam. For Britain, it was the Boer War. The Boers were South Africa's indigenous population. But surprisingly, they weren't black, they were white settlers. They were descendants of Dutch settlers who later imposed apartheid. Many of today's elites in South Africa are their descendants. The age of exploration lasted much longer than most people think, right? It's been 500 years, so if something happened during early Joseon, we should call those people natives. You might think there were Africans before. That's the wrong way to think about it. If they arrived in early Joseon and settled, then they're the natives. At its peak, Britain went to war with the Boers, even though they were white. They were the only white indigenous group in Africa, and even Britain struggled to defeat them. These are British corpses. They were devastated. They were crushed by Boer guerrilla tactics. It looked a lot like America's Vietnam War. 45,000 British soldiers died, and the war cost a fortune. The deeper issue was that a massive human rights scandal tore Britain apart internally. They won the war, but basically gave everything up. Since the Boers fought guerrilla style, the men abandoned their villages and fled to the mountains. Britain didn't know how to respond. What should they do with the women and children? Their conscience wouldn't allow killing them, but if left alone, they supported the guerrillas. So they thought, let's build camps, and hastily did so. But those camps became death traps. This is Africa. Poor sanitation killed countless children. 27,000 Boers died in those camps. Most of them were children. The children are especially vulnerable. Disease must have spread too. That's why Britain was so tormented by the war. Britain started losing its confidence, and many military operations ended in failure. This is where Churchill comes in. He was a war correspondent and got captured. Whether as a journalist or soldier, he escaped captivity. You know Churchill won the Nobel Prize in Literature, right? He later became Prime Minister of Britain. He won the Nobel for his book, The Second World War. He loved writing and began his career as a journalist. He wrote about his escape and became a national hero. He was already famous, but this sealed it. Germany studied the Boer War in detail. Now remember what we said about America's Vietnam War. People think it was just a meaningless war where they lost and were embarrassed, but it wasn't that simple. Losing in Vietnam was so serious that it sparked a genius-level geopolitical shift, an idea that broke conventional wisdom. The US flipped China, turning chess into Go. That strategic shift is what led them to eventual victory. Now take Russia. Militarily, it's a great power. But if it fumbles a withdrawal from Ukraine and looks weak, then it starts to sink, because the whole world is watching. Russia has many neighbors it suppresses along its borders. If they see weakness, they'll rise up. That's why prestige, even bluster, matters so much. Britain completely lost its aura of invincibility. 17 months before the Boer War, there was the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, where they basically massacred the enemy with Maxim guns. They had just used those same Maxim guns to commit slaughter and thought, as long as we have Maxim guns, we're fine. So why did they suffer so badly in the Boer War? The Boers were Dutch-descended farmers, and Britain underestimated them. Come on, how could we lose to farmers? But the Boers had Maxim guns too, and they used guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of local terrain to lure British generals into traps and destroy them. And now the Rothschilds, well, they did something fit for a conspiracy theory. They managed to get the Maxim gun patent licensed to a German manufacturer. So by 1908, Germany was fully armed with Maxim guns, and in World War I, trench warfare and machine guns caused massive casualties. Both sides were spraying bullets. If you lifted your head, you'd get shot. Germany saw that Britain wasn't invincible, and that changed everything. From Germany's point of view, if Britain struggles with Russia, they won't even be able to hold India. They're finished. Paul Kennedy wrote in the 1980s, before China's rise, "Has there ever been a time in history when two neighboring countries' productivity and national power reversed as rapidly as it did between Britain and Germany in just one generation?" Germany caught up with shocking speed. As of 1870, Britain accounted for 70% of continental Europe's GDP output. That's overwhelming. 50% would already be dominant. France and Germany combined were just 30%. Britain alone had 70%. But just a few decades, maybe 2 generations passed, and Britain, France, and Italy combined still couldn't match Germany's electricity usage. From 1901 to 1914, Germans won 18 Nobel Prizes. That's twice as many as Britain and 4 times more than the US. German science and technology advanced remarkably. Between the 1860s and 1913, Germany's GDP surged. They steadily caught up and finally surpassed Britain on the eve of World War I. But there was one area Germany didn't surpass. Britain still held superiority in battleship numbers. So why did World War I break out? Because Germany got stronger. Now let's look at today. If the US and China go to war, why would they? Because China is rising? But Koreans today see China's rise and think only about market opportunity. That's not enough. We live in a world defined by geopolitics. It's serious. That's why the most common historical parallel to US-China competition is Germany and Britain before World War I. Realism says you don't need any other explanation. This alone explains the situation. So Britain had to act while it still had naval superiority. Britain was the classic offshore balancer. You saw the map. Britain held everything except Europe. They kept their distance from Europe. That's what we call splendid isolation, a grand strategy of intentional separation. Britain even passed it into law in 1889. As a maritime power, Britain was obsessed with its navy. There was this idea called the two-power standard, that Britain's navy should outnumber the next two largest navies combined. Always have more warships than both number 2 and 3 put together. Churchill later became head of the Royal Navy and launched bold reforms. He believed, if the navy is destroyed, the British Empire will vanish like a dream. At the time, ships ran on coal. He converted them to oil. Churchill once said, for 400 years, British foreign policy has been to resist the strongest, most aggressive, and most dominant power on the continent. So if you want to understand America today, look at how Britain behaved. If France is strong, does Britain ally with France? That might sound logical. But Britain never said, Napoleon is strong, let's join him. If Napoleon grows strong, Britain joins his enemies. If Germany grows strong, it backs whoever opposes Germany. If the Soviet Union rises, Britain sides with its opponents. Britain has always chosen this way. So, if this is a rule of global geopolitics, when Japan was rising in East Asia, did the US ally with Japan? No, they allied with Japan's opponents. Now that China is rising, who will the US side with? With China's rivals, of course. That's how an offshore balancer behaves. Elites may understand this logic, but it's hard to explain to the general public. To the public, it has to be framed as moral and lawful. As it happens, Germany makes a mistake. The Kaiser Wilhelm II did something foolish. According to Kissinger's book, Wilhelm II grew up with his British cousins, but he always felt inferior in writing, in sports. We tend to compare ourselves most to siblings or cousins, right? And when everyone around you is a prince or princess, the contrast feels even more intense. That prince is so handsome. That one's amazing at sword fighting. Royal blood was expected to be strong, good at riding, fighting, and they received top training. But Wilhelm II had a deformed hand he couldn't keep up. So he was probably mocked for it. So if you analyze his psychology, Wilhelm had a deep rivalry with his mother's side. Some say he fought so hard out of deep inferiority. That's not the realist explanation, though. By the way, Wilhelm II is William in English. When his father died and he became king, the first thing he did was fire Bismarck because he wanted to rule on his own. Bismarck, of course, was the chancellor who unified Germany, one of history's greatest statesmen. He held office for nearly 30 years. Bismarck was kind of like Deng Xiaoping in a way. The premier Deng fired wasn't Zhou Enlai, it was Zhao Ziyang. Zhou was a reformist nurtured by Deng, but after Hu Yaobang died, he failed to handle Tiananmen and was purged, living under house arrest for 20 years until his death. A tragic figure. So Bismarck was like Germany's Deng Xiaoping. He warned that if Germany overreached, Russia and France would strike together. At the time, Germany wasn't strong enough, so knowing when to act and when not to was key. That kind of judgment is why he lasted in power for so long. If he'd made enemies everywhere, he wouldn't have lasted that long. But it didn't work out with the young emperor. The young emperor had a big ego and didn't want to listen to old Bismarck, so he fired him. Henry Kissinger writes this: since Bismarck, restraint has been the virtue most lacking among Germans. There was a foreign minister named von Bülow. Later he became chancellor. Appointed by Wilhelm II to replace Bismarck, von Bülow once said, there was a time when Germans gave land to one neighbor and the seas to another, and reserved for themselves the skies, ruled only by pure ideals. The land refers to Russia. The sea, of course, means Britain. But those days are over. We don't wish to cast shadows on anyone. No, but we too would like a cozy place in the sun. They said this openly and proudly, even without saying it. Germany's rise made France, Russia, and Britain nervous. But to say it out loud, that made it worse. And so came the unexpected, the triple. In French, triple entente, translated in Korea as three-power cooperation. Capitalized entente refers to the WWI-era alliance of France, Russia, and Britain. These three were enemies, if not outright rivals. Britain and France were worse than Korea and Japan. No reason for them to be close. The Imjin War lasted just a few years, but these guys fought for over 100 years. And there's no way Britain and Russia liked each other either. Britain even came all the way to East Asia to contain Russia by allying with Japan just to check Russia. But Germany pushed them into cooperation because they created the Morocco crisis. In Morocco, a French colony in North Africa, Germany stirred up the Sultan to defy France. France's global status had declined, but just like today, France's image didn't match its actual capabilities. There's a big gap between how it looks and what it can do. Europe today is like Germany giving France a piggyback ride and France shouting on top, "That's the EU." One day that day will come when Germany throws France off. It happened back then too. Germany saw through France's bluster and humiliated them by destabilizing just one colony. So Germany won that round, but it pushed Britain and France together. Britain usually favored isolation. Do we really need an alliance with France? Oog, not ideal. But France courted them, and eventually they agreed. But let me tell you, we said the Korean War played a role in shaping the post-Yadi world order, right? It connects to the Vietnam War too. Whether by destiny or coincidence, Korea played a key role here too. Empress Myeongseong of Korea was close to Russia. Japan defeated the Qing and took the Shandong Peninsula. Russia wanted to counter Japan, so it allied with Germany. And since Japan was still weak, they pushed it back. Japan resented this, and things escalated when Emperor Gojong and his court moved closer to Russia. Japan decided to go all in against Russia. Normally, Japan would have lost to a global power like Russia. Japan wasn't a major power yet, but Russia was. However, Russia didn't have a Pacific fleet. They had to sail all the way around. Britain controlled the seas and blocked them. Russia had to detour all the way back, completely exhausted, and they were crushed. Before Russia lost, it became the common enemy of Britain, France, and Germany. Russia had always been expansionist, but now Russia was too weakened, and that's how the impossible happened. Britain and Russia formed an alliance. Britain had just joined Japan to check Russia, but they didn't expect Japan to completely defeat Russia. Once Russia was humiliated, Britain and Russia formed an alliance. That happened just before World War I. We didn't plan it, but global history pivoted around the Korean Peninsula. The Russo-Japanese War triggered an unlikely alliance, and that alliance led to World War I. World War I caused interwar financial chaos, and that chaos gave rise to the Nazis. The Nazis brought about World War II. After World War II, Japan collapsed and Korea gained independence, but it was incomplete, and we ended up with the Korean War. That's how it all unfolded. So Korea's presence in global history is much bigger than we realize. Our presence, see, because of us, the Russo-Japanese War happened. Russia lost face, and Britain felt it had to support them. So they joined hands with their rival Russia. Bismarck had always believed Germany's survival depended on keeping France and Russia apart. But after him, Wilhelm II and his insecure advisors said, let's give it a try. That was their mindset. Psychological profiles don't explain everything, but they do have effects. Let's reflect on Britain's splendid isolation, because it explains modern America, and it holds meaning for us living in today's world. British statesmen had always said, never get entangled in Europe. So even when they allied with France, they kept insisting it was temporary. This is only temporary. It's only because the Germans are getting too aggressive, yeah? France had to swallow its pride and reach out to Britain. And many historians speculate on this point. If Wilhelm II had said to his British relatives, why would I fight my mother's family? Let's just get along. There may have been no World War I, and the British Empire might not have collapsed. That's the idea. In fact, toward the end, Britain feared it would be dragged into the war. So they waved a yellow handkerchief toward Germany. It was called the Haldane Mission. The naval minister went to Germany to meet Wilhelm. He said, we'll stay neutral if you do too. Wilhelm scoffed. Why would we make a deal with you? He basically implied, fine, but only if you guarantee neutrality when I fight France and Russia. If you stay neutral, then I'll stay neutral now. Even up to the last moment, Britain was trying to avoid war. It wasn't their issue anyway. France, meanwhile, desperately needed Britain's alliance. In this cartoon, that's Wilhelm II, that's the British gentleman, and she represents France. She's depicted as a French street woman. Wilhelm's gesture mocks them. You two, whatever, good luck with that. If Wilhelm had instead said, we should keep peace with our cousins in the British Empire, history might have taken a very different path. British isolationism earned them the nickname, the untrustworthy English. That's what makes studying geopolitics so fascinating. People change, but geography keeps exerting the same power. And Britain still behaves the same way today. Brexit, right? They left. And when Brexit happened, what did European elites say? These damn Brits, can't trust them as always. We must avoid involving ourselves in European affairs unless our involvement is the only way to restore balance on the continent. And especially, never engage in land warfare on the continent. Since the 19th century, the only times Britain sent troops to Europe were to stop Napoleon when France rose as a great power. They deployed troops to contain France, then again in World War I, to stop Wilhelm II's Germany, and then they withdrew. During the interwar period, Britain stayed distant, no matter what happened on the continent. They said, yo, you guys figure it out, until Churchill stepped in to stop Hitler. Britain was a toothless tiger by then, but it still had a duty to contain the Soviet Union. Britain was the only one left with a functioning military while Germany was destroyed. France wasn't really a meaningful player, and though it may have been at America's request, British troops were stationed in West Berlin for a long time. Aside from that, Britain stayed out of continental Europe for over 80 years. They called it splendid isolation and stuck to it. Maybe when we call the British gentlemen or thoughtful, that's because their diplomacy helped them preserve their empire for so long by staying out of unnecessary wars. Back then, the European continent was constantly erupting in conflict. But this isn't just Britain's story, it's about the foreign policy choices America faces today. That's why it matters. It's a historical mirror for us. Even before Trump, Peter Zeihan warned, we must prepare for a Eurasia without the United States. Peter Zeihan's new book just came out, the title, The End of the World. It argues that once the US pulls out, Eurasia will descend into total chaos. His arguments are worth reading. There's real insight in them. But I don't agree with his overall outlook. I have a different view. Zeihan argued that if anyone could pull US troops out of Eurasia gracefully, and with flair almost theatrically, it would be Trump. He said so quite explicitly. But Trump's presidency didn't last long. Ironically, Biden's first 2 years were more Trumpian than Trump's. What did Biden do about Myanmar? What did he do about Kazakhstan? And what exactly is he doing about Ukraine? From this angle, things look grim. The US seems to be taking on the role of an offshore balancer, like Britain once did. If Korea and Japan fight, the US says, go ahead, work it out. Islands, history, whatever, solve it yourselves. That's where things like GSOMIA come in during Obama's East Asia rebalance. One of the biggest goals of his administration was Korea and Japan making peace. They needed to reconcile. But these two countries just wouldn't, so America's East Asia strategy stalled. At one point, the US noticed that Korea and Japan seemed to hate each other, especially Korea. It even raised the possibility Korea might side with China. That's partly why this lecture on the geopolitics of Bitcoin exists. It started with the questions Zeihan posed and the uneasy global mood. Because our era is fundamentally different from the past, I wanted to explain this, provoke your thoughts, and give you something to seriously reflect on. Britain kept its distance, but in WWI it couldn't stay out. They intervened and Britain itself collapsed. Britain had another chance to survive. If they had stayed out of World War II, maybe they could have made it. But they joined and ended up surrendering even their remaining empire. Whether that was the right choice or the wrong one, and by what standard we might even begin to assess it, I'm not sure. There is, of course, Britain's own perspective, and then there is the perspective of universal human history. British imperialism was like the golden standard of empire. It feels like a loss. The fact that it declined and vanished so thoroughly. Much of what we live under today still exists in the shadow of British imperialism. I mentioned it earlier. Europe is the origin of both the best and worst in the modern world. That's why we have to study European geopolitics, because Korea, Japan, and China never created the kind of diplomatic framework. That explains the world we live in today. To put it bluntly, we had no diplomats, no ambassadors. We barely even had a concept of sovereignty. Meanwhile, Europeans fought and invented the idea of sovereignty. They invented international law, embassies, and diplomacy as we know it. Our diplomacy used to mean little more than recognizing China as the center and occasionally sending tribute. And Japan, we saw them as outright barbarians. But the era we live in today, diplomacy isn't that simple anymore. That doesn't work now. Many countries are playing the game, and that game has rules, protocols, and legitimacy. To put it simply, why is Putin so widely condemned in today's international arena? Because borders are treated as sacred and he violated them? It wasn't even retaliation, he just invaded. That's a clear violation of international law, and that holds real weight. Earlier I may have sounded dismissive of law and morality, but it's not that simple. We humans are symbolic beings, so idealism is reality. Yes, I'm contradicting myself, criticizing idealism only to say it's reality, but that's real realism. True realism isn't narrow-minded. It acknowledges that even idealism is part of reality. Welcome to the vast and intricate world of realist thought. That's all for today's lecture. See you next week.